I got this 1/12 scale dollhouse dresser from the Dollar Tree, and I'll be doing an easy makeover to transform it into a beautiful piece of furniture. The dresser comes with these cheap wooden knobs, and I'll start by using my pliers to remove them. The knobs are glued into drilled holes, and they often come out easily, but sometimes they break instead. When a knob does break, it leaves some splintered wood behind, so I just use my X-Acto knife to cut off the splinters and make it level with the dresser. Then I sanded the drawers with my emery board. This is a cheaply made piece of furniture, so look around and make sure you sand off any imperfections. There's a lot of extra glue around the legs, and you can see it from the front of the dresser, so I used my X-Acto knife to carefully cut off some of the excess glue that's visible from the front. I got this packet of patterned paper at my local dollhouse store for 50 cents, and my plan is to use it to decorate this dresser. There are 4 different patterns included in the package, so I cut a small strip of each pattern to give myself an idea of what I wanted to do with the dresser. I ultimately decided to only use one piece of paper rather than a variety. The paper I chose has a yellow background and blue flowers, so I'll be painting the body of the dresser a blue color. I started by mixing 1 part phthalo blue with 2 parts cream-colored paint. Then I mixed a small amount of brown into the paint because I don't want a baby blue color, I would like a more rustic color. The brown paint darkened the blue and gave it more depth. I used a somewhat wide flat brush for applying the paint. I painted the front of the dresser even though I'll be adding paper to the front because I like to keep my options open. If for some reason I decided not to add the paper, it's much easier to keep going with the project if the whole piece is painted. I didn't mix enough paint to paint the entire dresser, but it turned out to be a happy accident because I decided to make the top look like stained wood and I really like the contrast. Since I had planned to paint the top, I wasn't careful about getting paint on it, but it was easy enough to wipe the paint away with a wet cloth and then sand anything that remained. Back to the body of the dresser, I decided to use some ivory paint to do some light dry brushing over the blue. This dry brushing helps tone down the contrast between the paper I'll be adding and the blue paint I mixed. Dry brushing is my go-to technique when I'd like to make a piece of furniture look rustic. I dry brushed the front of the dresser as well, paying particular attention to the spaces between the drawers, which will be visible once I add my paper. I have some more work to do on the body of the dresser, but for now I'm watering down some brown paint so I can begin the process of staining the wooden top. These dressers are made of wood that doesn't have a lot of natural variation in tone, so I'll be using a little bit of dark brown paint to add some of my own. After I applied my base coat, I used some dark brown paint in the same brush to draw thin lines on top. I did this while the watered down paint was still wet and I made sure not to overdo it. Then I wiped most of the paint off and use the brush sideways to blend the lines. Then I used some undiluted brown paint to cover up the messiness under the tabletop. This is the final painting step for the base before I add the paper. I used a couple colors of brown and slightly watered it down so I could add some streaks to the blue paint. I don't want to cover up everything I did previously, so I did this with a light hand. You can always add more, but it's harder to take it away, so I like to start this kind of thing slowly and build it. This is the same brown color I used to stain the top, which helps unify the dresser. Now I'm ready for the paper. I'm not really one for measuring and precision, so I just cut 4 pieces of paper out that are bigger than the drawers I'm applying them to, and I'll refine the size after. To get the right size for the drawers, I laid the piece of paper over the drawer and used my finger to press around the drawer to make an impression. I generously coated the front of the dresser with matte Mod Podge to apply the paper. The paper looks too bright and clean for my liking, so I mixed some brown paint into the Mod Podge to apply over top of the paper. I tested the mixture on a scrap piece of paper before committing to adding it to the front of the dresser. I used my finger to press each piece of paper to the Mod Podge. Then I used a little bit of extra Mod Podge on the ends to make sure they don't pop up. I covered the rest of the dresser using the same brownish matte Mod Podge mixture. It's normal for wet paper to become rippled, so before it completely dried, I used my finger to flatten any ripples. It worked really well, and all of my pieces of paper dried completely flat. I have a soft spot for dry brushing, so I brightened up the piece a bit more with some ivory. Then I sanded the edges of the top before sealing with gloss Mod Podge. All of that painting gave the top a lot of variation. Now it's time for knobs. I'm using these 3D printed knobs I designed in a program called Tinkercad and printed on my Elegoo Mars. I wrapped some tape around a jumbo popsicle stick to hold the knobs while I paint them. My knobs are made out of resin, so I'm just using regular acrylic paint. I started with a base coat of brown since I'm adding a bronze metallic paint and it doesn't show up very well without a dark base color. To make sure I don't miss any spots, I turn the popsicle stick in multiple angles. The knobs I designed have a rope detail, so I lightly went over them with bronze paint to bring out the details. I thought they were too dark for the dresser, so I added a bit of ivory dry brushing. I used my pencil to make marks on the left side of the dresser where I'll be adding the knobs. Then I made the same type of marks on the right, making sure to keep them similar to what I did on the left as far as distance from the end of the drawer. I like to add some brown shading around handles to make it look like dirt has collected over the years, so I got out my dry chalk pastels. I accidentally grabbed a damp brush, so the chalk pastels were a lot darker than they normally are. So I used a dry brush to diffuse it and then wipe some of it away as well. A damp brush makes chalk pastels apply a lot more pigmented and darker, so make sure you use a dry brush if you're looking for subtlety. Then I used some super glue and textured tweezers to attach the knobs. The super glue doesn't allow for a lot of time for repositioning, so you can also use white glue if that's what you're more comfortable with. I still wasn't completely sold on the color of the knobs, so I decided to try to mix up a dark red color to match the center of the flowers. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I think it has come a long way from the cheap dresser we started with. Make sure you check out my other dollhouse furniture makeovers, including more Dollar Tree flips.